Anthony Kirkland never had a chance. The 5-year-old Anthony Kirkland never had a chance. Exposed and subjected to domestic abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, abandonment, this child never had a chance. The first few years, as you've heard, are critical for the development of brain circuitry formed through attachment with caregivers. This, Anthony did not have. There are key connections between the brain injury, toxic abuse, and criminal behavior. Healthy attachment foundation requires a consistent, nurturing relationship between caregivers and child. This, Anthony did not have. As early as he can remember, around age 5, there were multiple family members who abused him sexually. He relates that his teen cousin, Dewana, another cousin, Demurel, both were sexual with him as a kindergartner and elementary school student. Dewana telling him to be quiet, don't tell. Demurel was sexual with him and told Anthony that if he went along, Anthony's father wouldn't beat him when he got home. But the beatings came anyway. It's not just about the sexual abuse. It is the helplessness, the emotional trauma, the defining moments of a child's life. This foundation, or here, the complete lack, influenced Anthony's ability to regulate emotion, display self-control, and form a healthy self-identity. His ability to do all of these things was severely compromised. At a time when his brain should have been laying down solid foundational neural circuitry for healthy relationships, language, problem solving, a healthy sense of self, Anthony was forced to use all of his energy just to survive. Just to survive. These brains that are wired up for survival are designed to keep the person safe from perceived life-threatening situations and people. Now, such adaptations are helpful in the face of a true threat, but here they were very unhelpful in general because these sort of individuals with these brains that are wired for this now view such situations as true threat when no true threat exists. The brain is oversensitized to true threat, and it goes into fight or flight mode when the situation doesn't call for it. In order to adapt to this dangerous environment that Anthony lived in on a daily basis, his brain structures actually formed differently, forming a threat center that was bigger than normal, and decreasing the thinking and self-control center in the form of a smaller prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and a thinner corpus callosum. Ladies and gentlemen, his brain actually changed. His brain changed at an early age, becoming far from normal. It was different. You heard that brains double in the first year of life. 1 million neural connections per second in the early brain. This is critical. But what happened here, the repeated chronic exposure to toxic stress actually changed Anthony's brain architecture, damaging those critical neural connections. Dr. Wu testified that the right amygdala is significantly enlarged, a finding that's associated in the medical literature with physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. The actual brain structures are documented different. The 5-year-old Anthony Kirkland and then the elementary school-aged Anthony Kirkland never had a chance. There were no boundaries in his family. He commonly was exposed to his parents having sex. His father was physically and verbally abusive to his mother. This was normal in his home. Or was it a home? It's actually a house. And I say house because I hesitate to call it a home. It certainly was not a secure place, not a comforting place, not a warm, sheltering place in which to grow up. He bore the brunt of the physical abuse from his alcoholic and violent father. He was hit with fists, brooms, extension cords, and other objects. The children of the family witnessed their father beat and rape their mother. He made the children witness this violence. Children's brains are very delicate at this age. The brain before age 12 is especially sensitive to multiple concussions and CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This was a pervasively toxic and dangerous environment. The exposure to sexuality and abuse defined Anthony Kirkland. He never had a chance. The preteen child, Anthony Kirkland, also never had a chance. The child who witnessed his father beating his mother, who yelled at him to get out of here. The child who ran and hid under the covers and held his hands over his ears. This child abused himself, who couldn't protect his own mother from the abuse she was enduring. The 9 or 10-year-old Anthony was abused by a next-door neighbor. She was a teen. She would beat him up. She had sex with him. He felt the helplessness of his mother not being able or willing to stop the physical abuse. The feelings of abandonment by his mother are strong even to this day. He describes a complete lack of any nurturing instinct of his mother. And candidly, ladies and gentlemen, he raised himself. This child raised himself. Anthony didn't have a chance. The child who was beaten, and you will see the reports in the exhibits, my dad beat the hell out of me. That's what he says. And you'll see the reports. The child who sought revenge at age 13 against an abusive alcoholic father. You'll see this in Dr. Van Nuys' report. The child who picked up a big chunk of ice and threw it at a bus his father was driving. The child who ran, who was chased by the father. This child, this teenager, never had a chance. The child who was told to take over when his father abandoned the family. This child whose role model in life, his father, had beaten and sexually abused, raped his mother. This child who simply did things his father had done. Attacked his mother, and then he started having sex with his sisters at age 13 or 14. He became forceful, aggressively, and sexually with family members. Suffered mood swings, assaulted and choked his siblings, all in his early teen years. Started abusing drugs, self-medicating in a desperate effort, I would submit, to make himself feel better. Anthony Kirkland, this child, never had a chance. He took on the identity of the aggressor, his father. He began to reenact the abuse by himself being the aggressor, the one with the perceived power. The early formative years are foundational in building secure, healthy attachment relationships and a healthy sense of identity and self-esteem. This normally leads the teen years to capitalize on that foundation so that a child can learn in school, become good collaborators with peers and adults, and can continue to develop self-regulation of emotions and behavior. This development Anthony simply didn't have. He had a complete lack of healthy peer relationships. It's described that he lacked ties to school and other community institutions, no extracurricular activities, baseball team, no art class, no church group, no opportunity to have any mentors. His experience instead was of isolation, and he abused drugs and alcohol consistently by these mid-teen years. There were no protective adults for him, no role models, no mentors. To compound this, he suffered an additional head injury he received while working at the Queen City Barrel Company when he was 17. This, on top of the regular beatings by his father as a child, too young to fight back. Anthony, the teen and young adult, didn't have a chance. Without a foundation from these early years, Anthony, the adult, didn't have a chance. Once it got to this stage, it was too late. His brain was already wired up. It no longer had the plasticity, the ability to adapt in any positive way. It was too late. With a brain subject to neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, head trauma, domestic violence, he had the brain changes that caused the brain to misjudge non-threat as true threat, thus setting off in him the fight or flight response. The injuries he sustained predisposed him to violence. It's not an excuse for his behavior, but instead it helps explain how this happened. Combined with the environmental factors, the toxic environment in which he grew up, it led to a catastrophic failure in his ability to regulate his behavior and conform it to the requirements of the law. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you go back to the jury room, you'll have with you exhibits. As part of those exhibits, you'll have Defense Exhibit 5 that's divided into subparts. You will see medical records from Mercy Franciscan Mount Airy from October 11th of 2004, where he was transported by Life Squad to the emergency room after a bicycle accident. You'll see in those records, and please review them, you'll see in those records that he fell to the ground while rounding a corner on his bike, complained of shoulder and head pain to squad personnel, complained of right face pain, and physical exam revealed tenderness over the right zygoma. You'll also see mitigation reports, the summaries by Mr. Lee of family member interviews. Defense Exhibit 6, for example, Roberta Baldwin reports that after the bicycle accident that we just described, Anthony frequently complained of headaches, dizziness, and feeling off. That's a quote. He was a completely different person after the accident, and by 2006, Anthony had lost his job, been kicked out of her home after fighting, and was living in a van. The church even asked him not to return. January 26th of 2007, you'll also see records from an automobile collision. Again, he has suffered head pain from a motor vehicle crash, is transported by squad to the emergency room, having hit his head on a guardrail on the left front doorpost. You'll make note that he appeared somewhat confused, complained of head pain near the left frontal lobe. Reddened area was noted. A CT of the head was performed on that same day, a CT scan, and we've heard a lot about various and sundry exams, CTs and MRIs. What it indicates are bilateral nasal age indeterminate fractures. Fractures that actually show up on the CT scan documenting facial head trauma. Ladies and gentlemen, also importantly, Anthony seeks multiple interventions on at least 6 occasions during this time period for serious mental issues that he is having. He looks for help from medical professionals on his own. On November 29th of 2008 at University Hospital, he presents to the emergency room with complaints of depression. He was upset. 6 or 7 days later, on December 5, he shows up at the emergency room visit, is evaluated for a psychiatric emergency. It's late at night. He reports suicidal ideation for 2 weeks, mood swings, Ultimately, the diagnosis is of major depressive disorder, and it's a psychological admission. It's noted that he has bipolar disorder and adjustment disorder with depressed mood. Later that same month, December 23, emergency room hospital. He complains of dizziness, passing out, confusion. 3 days later, December 26th, an emergency room visit, dizziness, blackout episodes, syncope. Reported the head injury from the 2004 bike accident as well. Reported the prior car accident as well. When they ask him, what head injuries, what trauma have you had? He self-reports that in 2008. Testing is then ultimately ordered. An MRI of the brain is performed. History that's noted and the reason for the testing, head injury, possible seizures. Of remote left orbital wall fracture is seen. Again, documenting head trauma. February 28th of 2009, he is assaulted. He's punched several times in the face, hit with fist in face and head. Tenderness over the left side of the face, blurred vision. Facial edema over the left zygomatic arch. Head trauma. More issues. Ladies and gentlemen, this is about 1 week before Esme Kenny's death.
Is everybody okay, ladies and gentlemen? Everybody all right? Stretch. Why don't you go ahead and stretch? That's a good idea. Everybody all set? Thank you all very much.
Your Honor, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard from Joseph Wu, a board-certified psychiatrist with specialized training in brain and PET MRI imaging. Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Irvine. He teaches neuroimaging, PET and MRI neuroimaging, and he's received numerous awards, published 67 peer-reviewed articles, including those on PET and MRI imaging, TBI, traumatic brain imaging, or traumatic brain injury, and various other diseases. He's on the committee to review grant applications for the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. It's set up to allocate funding for improving the quality of diagnosing and treating returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan. Injuries involving IED. This is cutting-edge medicine and research. Research regarding CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, using the most sensitive, accurate, and up-to-date assessments for the brain. You heard Dr. Wu say, most radiologists aren't going to find what I find. The radiologists do a visual analysis of the scans, and that's it. No statistical analysis. Where the radiologists stop, Dr. Wu continues his analysis by applying the numeric information. He testifies that on PET scan imaging, Anthony's frontal lobe is small, a finding that's consistent with multiple traumatic head injuries. That's the part of the brain that is important for cognitive skills, judgment, sexual behaviors. On MRI, quantitative volumetrics, he notes that the size of the amygdala is highly abnormally increased on the right. He indicates that this is consistent with early childhood neglect, a complete lack of a nurturing environment as a child, consistent with the Romanian orphanages study. Unwanted children basically fed with no nurturing, just basically warehoused. MRI DTI, the diffuse tensor imaging. Findings are consistent with traumatic brain injuries, areas where the axons, the internet wires, if you will, have actually been sheared or torn, physically destroyed. A leakage of the fluid, and Dr. Wu describes it as a tear in the straw. Damage to the frontal lobe area of the brain causes significant alteration in the ability to regulate impulses, regulate aggression, and control judgment. This repeated history of traumatic brain injury, combined with the severe childhood neglect and abuse that Anthony Kirkland suffered, led to Anthony Kirkland, the adult, not having a chance. Dr. Wu notes that the findings of the scans of Anthony's brain, the decreased neocortical to cerebellum ratio, are very similar to the patterns he has observed in individuals who have CTE, like NFL players or others with multiple head traumas. 109 of 110 recent NFL players had the classic hallmarks of CTE, many of whom had significant breakdowns in the ability to regulate aggression. Dr. Wu testified that CTE is a very significant condition which causes, sometimes 10 or 20 years after the initial insult, after the initial injuries, insignificant breakdown in behavioral regulation and regulation of impulses. Because of the multiple traumatic brain injuries, severe emotional childhood neglect, and severe physical abuse, Anthony does not have that ability to control his impulses. A person with a normal brain, one that is intact, a person with a loving childhood has a momentary, fleeting feeling of anger or aggression, and your brain inhibits those impulses. But here, Anthony, because of the toxic stress and brain damage that he suffered, has lost the ability to calm or to soothe or to quench those feelings. The ability to stop those impulses is what Dr. Wu described as being like driving a car with no brakes, and then you hit a curve. A normal individual can tap the brakes, slow down the car, but Anthony, with no brakes, crashes through the guardrails. In his statement to Detective Witherall and Hilbert, Anthony says, "I can't control me." He describes anger fits and rage. His anger fits intensify and get worse, and he describes giving into the anger and giving into the hate. Very tellingly, in his statement to detectives, Detective Hilbert, he even describes the bicycle accident of 2004 and the subsequent mood, behavior, and attitude changes. He describes the use of drugs and alcohol. He describes his lack of judgment, his lack of understanding. He describes his hopelessness and his helplessness. He didn't have a chance. You heard from Dr. Waxman, an expert on PET imaging. And I would note, PET imaging only. 2/3 of the tests that Dr. Wu discussed, Dr. Waxman has no opinion about. The MRI DTI and MRI quantitative volumetrics, he has no opinion on those. Even he admits that traumatic brain injury in Mr. Kirkland's case cannot be ruled out. He was only familiar with one injury in Mr. Kirkland's history, the 2004 bicycle accident. Not aware of other records or history. The prosecution went out of its way to discredit Dr. Wu because he charged for his services. Yet it's Dr. Waxman taking the lion's share of money for services rendered. Dr. Waxman opposing Dr. Wu on about 50 times over 20 years, following him around the country. In this case, he criticizes the use of color scales in his testimony, but then he admits Dr. Wu used both color scale and grayscale. He criticizes the use of resting protocols, but that's all that's available at the Ohio State Medical Wexner Center. No indication that the testing was done inappropriately at all. I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that much of his testimony was directed at criticizing techniques and things that were not done in this case, did not need to be done, and are irrelevant. Dr. Waxman didn't review the medical records of the defendant. He can't make a determination regarding mental disease or defect like Dr. Benes and Dr. Wu can. They have the expertise to give an opinion regarding behavior. Waxman doesn't. Dr. Benes has seen Anthony, interviewed him for a dozen hours. Waxman hasn't done that. Dr. Wu documents the brain changes that have occurred over time for Anthony. the traumatic brain injury, the CTE, the overall damaged brain, the enlarged amygdala. The overreactive amygdala, the threat center of the brain that misperceives negative faces or actions as true threat when the threat is actually not life-threatening. The threat response is overreactive and takes control. The amygdala is overreactive to threats or physical or perceived threats that set off this fight response. This can be caused by tone of voice, body posturing, being hit, someone being in his space. Verbal fights with Cassandra Crawford, running into each other, showing concern, fear, surprise on her face, Esme Kinney. Anthony described how Esme's face turned into Becky, a woman who had betrayed him, then back into Esme, then back into Becky. Given his helplessness and rage experiences during domestic violence in his formative years as a child, Dr. Van Ace testifies that this re-triggered primitive rage and helplessness associated with the abuse. Anthony says, "I don't know how to handle stress. I lash out." He says that in his statement to Detective Hilbert. "I was so angry." Anthony's mental health history documents recurrent serious bouts of depression. He was actively suicidal since 1987. In 2009 and 2013, attempted suicide with overdoses of prescription medication. Dr. Van Ace, you heard from her. She received her master's from Bowling Green, did her clinical internship through Harvard Medical School, PhD from Bowling Green. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and chief clinical officer providing oversight for foster care, residential treatment for youth, and adult home-based services, the toughest of the cases out there. She used structured interview techniques to determine whether abuse to Anthony happened and the nature of the abuse. And it's her determination that Anthony meets the criteria for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with dissociation. She describes the 4 core symptom clusters of PTSD. Intrusion, the flashbacks and nightmares. He sees his father's face and hears his voice when it's actually another person being aggressive toward him. He flashes back to other people's faces when committing crimes. He has recurrent dreams about the places where he had been hurt as a youngster. Avoidance. Anthony also avoids talking about his past, if possible. She used techniques in an effort to gain that information from him. He also suffers from arousal and reactivity, stress intolerance, and negative thoughts and beliefs and mood, feelings of abandonment, rejection, and crippling by his parents. With dissociation, derealization, you heard Dr. Van Ace talk about, experiences of unreality or the surroundings of like the world is dreamlike or you're seeing something through a fog. Depersonalization, feeling detached from, as if you were an outside observer viewing your own body. He describes instances where there is automatic control, and that's his term, automatic control over his body that he watches occur. The structures and chemistry of the brain were altered due to the early toxic stress and trauma, leading to PTSD, causing anxiety, high arousal, poor sleep and concentration. As part of her structured interview process, Dr. Van Ace conducted the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, ACEs survey. He had 9 of 10 ACEs. You heard her testify to that. Physical abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, psychological abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, mental illness in a household member, substance abuse in a household member, and separation from a parent or parents. The adult Anthony Kirkland didn't have a chance. His amygdala causes his brain to switch over from allowing him to experience the present moment to defaulting to a flight or fight response that's outside of his conscious moment. It's a survival technique, one that is related to the toxic stress that he encountered as a youngster. He describes an experience when he discussed the crime against Esme Kenny. He expresses what happened. I'm the only one here. Part of me had to have done it. I was the only one there, but it is like automatic. He loses time walking place to place. Things in his room have been moved to places he doesn't remember putting them in. He finds writings of various sayings in his folders, but doesn't remember writing them. This early toxic stress that he experienced weakened his brain, destroyed healthy neural circuitry, thinking structures, emotions. By age 9, his brain had its basic architecture in place, and his brain just had to adapt to survive. It was wired for survival only. He didn't have the opportunity to experience a safe family and ultimately the developmental trajectory that led to PTSD and dissociation that later explain, not excuse, behaviors connected with his crimes. He never had a chance. Ladies and gentlemen, in order for you to decide that the sentence of death shall be imposed upon Anthony Kirkland, the state of Ohio must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the aggravating circumstances of which defendant was found guilty are sufficient to outweigh the factors in mitigation of imposing the death sentence. This, we submit to you, the state of Ohio has not done. Mitigating factors in this case are factors about Anthony Kirkland that weigh in favor of a decision, your decision, that a life sentence rather than a death sentence is appropriate. Mitigating factors include, but are not limited to, the history, character, and background of Anthony Kirkland, whether at the time of committing the offenses, Anthony Kirkland, because of a mental disease or defect, lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, and any other factors that weigh in favor of a sentence other than death. We've discussed the history, character, and background of Anthony Kirkland. We've discussed the severe childhood abuse that he has suffered. We've discussed the toxic developmental environment, the environment that actually changed his brain chemistry, changed his brain. We discussed the domestic violence that he saw, the domestic violence that he himself endured, the repeated sexual abuse that he suffered, the emotional abuse, the lack of a consistent nurturing attachment with caregivers. The mentors, the people, the role models in his life were virtually non-existent in a positive way. They were existent certainly in a negative sense. But there was nobody there that was a protective factor for him. There was no true role model. We have a history of multiple traumatic brain injuries, the repeated beatings by his abusive alcoholic father, and neglect. Ultimately, his father left the home. We have evidence that his mother had a complete lack of nurturing instinct and depression. At the time of committing the offenses, Anthony Kirkland, because of a mental disease or defect, lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of law. Injuries he sustained predisposed him to violence. We've talked about the repeated traumatic brain injuries. We talked about the bicycle accident. We talked about the auto accident. The frontal lobe of the brain is abnormally small. Dr. Wu testified to that. The amygdala is enlarged. That's the portion of the brain that is responsible for perceiving threats. It's survival in Anthony. Axons are torn, causing leaks in the straw. That's what Dr. Wu testified to. The fluid that actually goes through those internet cables leaks out, in Anthony's case, because the structures of the brain are actually torn. There's a lack of ability to control aggression, impulses, and judgment. I can't control me. And here, just like Dr. Wu indicates, in essence, Anthony's like a car with no brakes. Normal people would be able to tap the brakes and slow down the car. Anthony can't slow down the car. He has no brakes. And he suffers from PTSD. Intrusion, those are those flashbacks and thoughts, the avoidance, the arousal and reactivity, and the negative thoughts and mood. With dissociation. And dissociation is what we submit happened here in the offenses that he was found guilty of. Ladies and gentlemen, we submit to you that any other factors that weigh in favor of a sentence other than death include his severe history of mental health problems. He has a long-standing history and struggle with mental health issues, bipolar disorder. And he sought help himself at University Hospital on multiple occasions, a psych ward admission, suicidal thoughts, syncope, passing out. Ladies and gentlemen, we submit to you that the acceptance of responsibility, apologies, and remorse are also appropriate for you to consider. And I believe they have significant weight. Anthony is confused about his rage and bewildered that he carried out these actions. He's confused about why he would kill people who didn't deserve it. He's befuddled by the dissociative reaction that he experienced. He was not looking for people to hurt. You heard his apology to families, friends, and loved ones hurt by his actions. Those were his words, not my words, not Mr. Kutcher's words, his words. He has a history of drug and alcohol abuse. That's clear through his records. That's clear in his interviews with the detectives. And it's clear that it started at a very early age. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, his confession and cooperation with law enforcement. I would submit to you that information that he voluntarily provided enabled the police to identify the body of Kim Urolison, and her family ultimately was able to learn what had happened to her. The detailed information that Anthony gave was accurate and truthful. And it's fair to say that the homicide may never have been solved without Anthony's confession. Her remains were returned to her family. She was buried with her mother. I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that is a mitigating factor, and it is entitled to significant weight in your consideration. Ladies and gentlemen, we submit to you that the aggravating circumstances of these homicides do not outweigh the factors in mitigation of imposing a death sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, when you go back into private, into the jury room, you'll have 16 verdict forms to review, 4 for each count. Each will have language on it. Counts 2 and counts 4 are regarding Cassandra Crawford. Count 9 and count 11 are regarding Esme Kinney. One form will be death. One form would be life imprisonment without parole eligibility for 25 full years. One form would be life imprisonment without parole eligibility for 30 full years. One form would be life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. So you will have 4 forms for each count for a total of 16. I will submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Mr. Kirkland is not asking for you to sentence him to life imprisonment with parole eligibility at 25 years. I would submit to you he's not asking you to sentence him to life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 30 years. Instead, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kirkland is asking for you to sentence him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It's your absolute right to utilize the forms that indicate parole eligibility after 30 full years or parole eligibility after 25 full years, but we don't even request that you do that. We would respectfully request that you simply consider 2. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and death for each count. So instead of 16 total forms, 8. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important to remember that any one juror, any one of you, may prevent a death penalty determination by that juror's finding that the aggravating circumstances do not outweigh the mitigating factors. Or any 2 of you, or any 3 of you, or all of you. Any one mitigating factor standing alone is sufficient to support a sentence of life imprisonment if the aggravating circumstances are not sufficient to outweigh the mitigating factors by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, ladies and gentlemen, the cumulative effect of the mitigating factors will also support a sentence of life imprisonment. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider this living, breathing soul, this real person, this man, Anthony Kirkland, never had a chance. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Linden.